Giordano Bruno wasn't burned for saying the earth moves. Copernicus said the same thing and died in bed. So why did the Vatican burn Bruno alive in 1600 and then spend the next 3.5 centuries making sure no one could read what he wrote? His book stayed on the Vatican's banned list until 1948. 348 years. What was in them? Let's start with what the popular story gets wrong. We picture Bruno as a young, idealistic priest, a rebellious youth cut down in his prime. But when he was executed, Giordano Bruno was 52 years old. He was not a young martyr. He was a seasoned philosopher who had spent decades traveling across Europe and who knew exactly what he was doing. Here is the second thing the popular story omits. After Bruno's execution, every trace of him was systematically erased. His books were seized, burned, added to the Vatican's index of forbidden books. For 250 years, even the fact that he had been burned alive was denied. The official Vatican position, they only burned his effigy. A puppet, a straw man. Think about that for a moment. Why would you deny burning someone? Unless you were afraid people would ask why. The Romans had a term for this, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. You do not merely kill the person, you erase them from history. You destroy every document, every portrait, every mention, as if they never existed at all. So how do we know anything about Bruno at all? This is where the story turns into a detective case. In 1848, a revolution swept through Italy. The uprising reached Rome. Pope Pius IX fled the Vatican, and for a brief chaotic moment, the archives were left unguarded. Among the revolutionaries who entered the Vatican was Giuseppe Mazzini, one of three heads of Italy's provisional government. He personally went into the Inquisition archives, and what he found there changed everything. For the first time in nearly 250 years, the world learned that Bruno had not been burned in effigy, he had been burned alive. But Mazzini did something careful. Some manuscripts, like a codex of Bruno's own handwritten treatises on magic, he took and later sold. But the trial documents, the verdict, the execution orders, those he did not steal. He copied them by hand, as if he knew the originals needed to stay in place. But here is a detail historians rarely mention. Mazzini was copying a copy. The Vatican's own scribes had already rewritten the originals long ago, with ink blots, blank spaces, and passages filled in by different hands. Then the revolution was crushed. Pope Pius returned. The archives were sealed again. Mazzini survived. He went on to become a senator and one of the architects of Italian unification, but the documents he copied would become a crucial piece of the historical record. 37 years of silence followed. Then, in 1886, a Vatican archivist named Gregory Palm discovered a manuscript containing the actual trial records of Giordano Bruno, the stenographic transcripts of his interrogations from 1592 to 1598. Pope Leo XIII immediately ordered them locked away. A church that claims to seek truth, locking away a trial transcript for another 60 years. Notice the pattern. The manuscript vanished into the Pope's personal archive. For another 39 years, not a single word leaked out. Then, in 1925, another Vatican archivist, Angelo Mercati, stumbled upon a reference to the discovery in the dead Pope's private papers. It took him another 17 years, until 1942, to actually locate the manuscript itself. This timeline is not speculation. It is documented by mainstream historians like Luigi Firpo, whose critical edition of the trial records, published by the University of Turin, remains the standard scholarly reference. Every date I am giving you can be verified in peer-reviewed academic sources. Consider this timeline. The documents were found in 1886, sealed by one pope, rediscovered by an archivist who searched for 17 years, and finally published in 1942, in the middle of World War II, while fascist Italy controlled Rome. The Catholic historians who published them did so not to vindicate Bruno, but to argue the Inquisition had been legally justified. And then, in 1948, Bruno's books were finally removed from the Index of Forbidden Works. In the post-war period, scholars across Europe gained new access to previously restricted materials. Italian and Russian academics, including the bibliographer Alexander Garfunkel, translated and published the declassified documents. Much of what we know about Bruno today traces back to this wave of post-war scholarship. But here is the question no one asks. If Bruno was just a scientist ahead of his time, why did every faction that touched his story try to reshape it? Every faction used Bruno's story for their own purposes. The fascist-era scholars published the trial records to justify state authority over individuals. Soviet academics turned him into a martyr of science against religion. The Vatican released documents selectively to defend the Inquisition's legal process. Each version told you more about the storyteller than about Bruno. Now let us go back to the beginning and reconstruct what actually happened. In 1592, Bruno was living as a private tutor in Venice, teaching a nobleman named Giovanni Mocenigo the art of memory, a complex mnemonic technique. When Bruno tried to leave, Mocenigo locked him in a basement, wrote a denunciation, and handed him to the Inquisition. The Venetian Inquisition interrogated Bruno 7 times. He answered calmly, logically, brilliantly. He dismantled Mocenigo's accusations point by point. The Venetian tribunal was ready to release him. At worst, he would be sent back to a monastery. The case was essentially over. And then something unexpected happened. Rome stepped in, and everything changed. The Roman Inquisition demanded Bruno be transferred from Venice to Rome immediately. The puzzling part? By all evidence, Rome had not even read Bruno's books yet. They did not know the specifics of his philosophy. And yet, in their very first letter, they called him something extraordinary. Not just a heretic, but an arch-heretic, the patriarch of heretics. Venice tried to refuse. For a brief moment, the Venetian Inquisition stood between Bruno and Rome. But they folded almost immediately. Bruno was shipped south. He would spend the next 8 years in a Roman dungeon. Here is where the historical record goes dark. We have the transcripts of 7 Venetian interrogations, but of the Roman interrogations conducted over 8 years, we have almost nothing, only marginal notes referencing them. 8 years of questioning, and the detailed records have never surfaced. 7 interrogations over a few months in Venice, fully documented. 8 years of interrogation in Rome, almost nothing survives. Does that look like an accident to you? Meanwhile, Rome built its case. They relied on testimony from 3 of Bruno's cellmates. 1. A man named Celestino gave testimony and then died in prison before the verdict. Another, a repeat offender named Graziano serving a life sentence, was released shortly after testifying against Bruno. As historian Luigi Firpo noted, the witness handling in this case was highly irregular. The third cellmate, a monk named Eino, testified and was then declared mentally unfit by the Inquisition and executed 6 months before Bruno. 1 witness dead before trial's end. 1 released after testifying. 1 released after testifying. 1 executed by the court that called him. The procedural irregularities are difficult to explain away. So if the trial was this irregular, what were the actual charges? This is where every popular account of Bruno falls apart. The final verdict listed 8 charges against Bruno. But here is the critical detail. The charges were never read aloud in the public square. The Inquisition told Bruno, in essence, you know what this is about. Whatever those 8 charges contained, the court did not want the crowd to hear them. Now, every popular account will tell you the charges were about heliocentrism and the infinity of the universe. But as historians like Francis Yates of the Warburg Institute have documented, heliocentrism was not declared heresy until 1616, 16 years after Bruno was already dead. You cannot convict a man of a crime that does not exist yet. What about the plurality of worlds, the idea that other planets harbor life? Bruno defended this position by quoting Thomas Aquinas, who had written openly about the possibility of multiple worlds. And Thomas Aquinas was a canonized saint whose teachings were the official philosophy of the Catholic Church. If it was heresy, then Aquinas was a heretic too, and that was clearly not the case. So we can rule out the two most popular explanations, which means the real reason is somewhere else entirely. Let's look at what Bruno actually wrote. During his trial, Bruno revealed something remarkable about the book industry. He told the Inquisition under oath, every single book of his that claims to be printed in Venice, Paris, or Frankfurt was actually printed in England. The publishers deliberately faked the city of origin to make them easier to sell on the continent. In one casual admission, Bruno exposed a widespread practice in the early printing trade. His most notorious book, the one mentioned repeatedly in the charges, was called The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast. It was published in England, dedicated to the powerful English lord Sir Philip Sidney, and financed by Sidney's close friend Fulk Greville, the first Baron Brooke, future Chancellor of the Exchequer. Bruno had connections at the highest levels of the English state. An Italian ex-monk, publishing in England, backed by the Queen's inner circle. What exactly was in this book that attracted that kind of patronage? Many scholars dismiss this book as satire, a philosophical joke, but Bruno himself, in the preface, directly tells the reader, do not take this lightly. Every speech in this dialogue, he writes, carries its own separate meaning, and he adds something peculiar, that everything in it must be viewed through special lenses, through special glasses. So what is actually in this book? It describes a grand council of the gods, Greek and Roman deities, including Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, and a curious character called Momos, the god of mockery, who has been summoned back from exile specifically because he can speak the truth to power. Jupiter is old, he is 36,000 years old, to be precise, and he knows he is dying. According to Bruno, these gods do not have permanent bodies. They are energies, essences that incarnate again and again in human form. They live, they die, they are reborn. Even Jupiter, the king of the gods, will eventually die and be reborn as something else entirely. Everything in the universe cycles. Nothing is permanent, not even divinity. Mortal gods, reincarnating souls. No permanent heaven, no eternal judge. This is not a tweak to Christian theology, it is a completely different operating system for reality. But there is more. Jupiter, knowing his end approaches, calls a great feast and surprises the assembled gods with an announcement. He wants to restructure the heavens before he dies. Every constellation, he says, has been corrupted by a vice, greed, wrath, lust, deception. Bruno describes these vices as living forces embedded in the fabric of the cosmos. The triumphant beast of the title is this network of vices, because they always win in human affairs. Jupiter's plan is to banish them from heaven and replace them with virtues, a cosmic restructuring carried out by dying gods on the eve of their own extinction. Dying gods trying to fix a broken universe before their time runs out. Does that sound like satire to you? Hidden among these cosmic dialogues are very specific claims. Bruno writes that in the recently discovered New World, meaning the Americas, chronicles will be found containing the history of the last 10,000 years and more. He drops this almost as a footnote, but remember his own instruction, every paragraph carries its own separate meaning. He also embeds an account of the Trojan War, not as metaphor but as a real event that the gods themselves reference as a pivotal moment, and the retelling of the Prometheus story that is dramatically different from the standard myth. In Bruno's version, Prometheus did not steal fire. He convinced Zeus to give humanity something far more significant, immortality. Zeus agreed. He filled barrels with the elixir of immortality and sent them to Earth on the back of a donkey. But the serpent, the Hydra, tricked the donkey into spilling the cargo. The liquid soaked into the ground and was lost. In Bruno's framework, The hierarchy between mortal humans and immortal gods was not natural. It was the result of sabotage. Humanity was meant to be equal to the gods, and that equality was stolen. Bruno also describes a war in Egypt. According to his account, a monster emerged from the caves of Tauros, meaning Crimea, and traveled to Egypt to fight the Olympian gods. The solution came from a figure called Capricorn, who suggested the gods disguise themselves as animals to approach the creature undetected. And this, Bruno claims, is why the Egyptian gods have animal heads. Not because of primitive superstition, because the Olympian gods literally disguised themselves as animals during a war in Egypt, and the humans who witnessed it began worshipping them in that form. Bruno is offering an alternative origin story for an entire civilization's religion. And then the book simply ends. Jupiter asks if the gods agree with his plan. They do. They go to feast, and the narrator, whom Bruno calls the Nolan, his own pen name, says he will go to his evening contemplations. No conclusion, no moral, no summary. It reads like a report, not a story. A book with encoded layers, backed by English lords, describing mortal gods, and he called himself the Awakener. Who exactly did Bruno think he was? When he arrived at Oxford, one of the most prestigious universities in Europe, he presented himself to the rector and faculty with these exact words: "I am the Awakener, the friend of God, Giordano Bruno, the Nolan, not a scholar, not a philosopher, the friend of God." In the epigraph of The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast, Bruno states that the contents were communicated to him directly by Mercury and told to Sophia, divine wisdom, and that he, the Nolan, was appointed to write them down. He is not claiming to be a philosopher with opinions. He is claiming to be a messenger, carrying received knowledge. This reading of Bruno is not fringe. Frances Yates, one of the most respected Renaissance scholars of the 20th century, argued in her landmark 1964 book Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition that Bruno saw himself not as a scientist, but as a religious reformer drawing on pre-Christian sources. Her work, published by the University of Chicago Press, transformed how historians understand this period. Bruno did not claim to have figured out the cosmos through reason. He claimed to have been told by divine sources. He presented himself as a prophet, or more precisely, as a vessel through which a pre-Christian wisdom tradition communicated with humanity. This was not philosophy. This was a rival revelation. And he did not travel randomly. Bruno's route for Europe is remarkable. He went from Naples to Rome, to Geneva, to Toulouse, to Paris, to London, to Oxford, to Wittenberg, to Prague, to Frankfurt, and finally back to Venice, where he was caught. Each stop was a major center of intellectual or political power. At every stop, powerful people helped him. In Geneva, the Marquis de Vico arranged employment. In Paris, King Henry III personally granted him a position. In London, the most powerful lords in England financed his publications. This was not a fugitive running from justice. This was someone with a network of influential supporters. A wanted heretic who dines with kings. A fugitive monk whom no one arrests for 16 years. The popular image and the historical record do not match. And yet Bruno behaved as though he were untouchable. In Geneva, a Calvinist city where you were required to convert, he refused, and they let him go. At Oxford, he publicly insulted the faculty and walked away unscathed. He antagonized Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists alike, and none of them could touch him until Venice. Bruno's books were rejected not just by Catholics, but by Lutherans and Calvinists alike. This detail is important. If he were simply a Protestant reformer, the Protestants would have welcomed him, but they opposed him just as fiercely as Rome did. Whatever Bruno represented, it threatened every established religious institution equally. Now compare Bruno to Galileo. Galileo said the earth goes around the sun. The church put him on trial. He recanted. He lived. He spent his final years under comfortable house arrest, dying peacefully at 77. The conventional story says they were persecuted for the same reason, but their outcomes were opposite. Galileo challenged the Church's model of the physical universe. That was manageable. You update the model, the Church adapts, life goes on. Bruno challenged the Church's monopoly on the nature of reality itself. He said the gods are mortal. He said the souls reincarnate. He said he was a direct messenger from a divine source that had nothing to do with Christianity. That is not a scientific disagreement. That is an existential threat. When the sentence was finally read on February 8, 1600, the Inquisition declared Bruno guilty and handed him to the civil governor for execution. But they added a peculiar legal formula. They urged the governor to carry out the punishment without shedding blood. On paper, the Church technically asked for mercy, a standard legal fiction of the period. Bruno's response to the verdict has survived across the centuries. He looked at the judges and said, "You pronounce this sentence with greater fear than I receive it. These are not the words of a man who has lost. These are the words of a man who has lost. These are the words of a man who believed his ideas would outlast his executioners." But there is one more detail about the execution that rarely gets mentioned. Before the execution, Bruno wrote a memorandum and sent it to the court. The tribunal made a show of opening it publicly, breaking the seal in front of witnesses, but they refused to read it. This is documented. Whatever Bruno wrote in his final statement, the Inquisition did not want it heard. And this explains why his books were banned for 348 years, longer than those of Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, or Descartes. Their ideas could be absorbed into the existing framework. Bruno's could not, because his books did not just describe a different universe, they described a different God. Or rather, different gods, plural, all of them mortal, all of them locked in cycles of death and rebirth. And what we received after 1948 was still incomplete. We got the summary of the investigation file. We got the Venetian interrogations. We got fragments and copies of copies. But the Roman interrogations, 8 years of questioning the arch-heretic of Europe, remain missing. The full verdict, with all 8 charges explained, gone. Bruno's final memorandum vanished. So let us assemble what we know. Bruno wrote books describing gods as mortal beings, the universe as cyclical and infinite, and himself as a divinely appointed messenger. His books were financed by the English aristocracy and printed secretly in England. Rome called him the patriarch of heretics before reading a single page. They imprisoned him for 8 years, relied on deeply questionable witnesses, refused to read his final testimony, and burned him on the first year of a new century. Then they erased his memory for 250 years. Where revolutionaries found the proof, the Vatican sealed it again. When scholars finally published the documents, they got only an incomplete version, and even today, the Church has never formally rehabilitated Bruno. In the year 2000, Pope John Paul II expressed regret, but explicitly refused to overturn the verdict. Why would an institution maintain a ban on a dead man's books for 4 centuries? Not because of astronomy, that was settled long ago. Because the ideas in those books challenge something more fundamental, the claim that any single institution has the right to define the nature of reality, the nature of God, and the boundary between the human and the divine. Bruno said the universe is alive. He said it has no center and no edge. He said it contains infinite worlds. He said the gods themselves are born and die and are reborn. He said the human soul does not go to heaven or hell, it returns again and again into new bodies. And he said he was told all of this directly by a wisdom tradition that predates Christianity. 400 years later, modern science tells us the universe contains 2 trillion galaxies, that it has no center, that the conditions for life exist on billions of planets, that matter and energy cycle endlessly through creation and destruction. Bruno was either the greatest intuitive mind in human history or he was telling the truth about where his knowledge came from. The standard story tells us Bruno was a brave scientist killed by a backward church, but the documented record reveals something stranger. He was a self-proclaimed prophet, supported by foreign aristocrats, writing in encoded layers, preaching a cosmology that made every institutional religion on earth irrelevant, not because it contradicted them, but because it rendered them unnecessary. They burned the man, they banned the books, they erased his name for 250 years, they sealed his last words unread, and they maintained the ban for 348 years through revolutions, world wars, and the fall of empires. Ask yourself, what kind of idea requires that much effort to contain? You pronounce this sentence with greater fear than I receive it. Bruno understood something his judges did not, that killing the messenger does not kill the message, and 4 centuries later, the Vatican still has not released the full file. The Roman interrogations, the 8 charges, the memorandum, the most important documents in the case remain sealed. The question